Welcome to the Rekindle XM podcast. I'm Michelle, your host today, and I'm joined by Masha and Brian. So today we are going to talk about why most of us need to upgrade our stress management skills. We're going to be talking about if stress coping is something we are born with, or do we have to learn how to do it? And why it is so important that we have a number of different stress coping skills to deal with the modern stressors. So, Brian and Masha, welcome. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So, most of us understand that
Our
we have a
shameless
lot of
book
stress.
plug. Why do I have to keep saying we need to talk about our shameless book plug?
Because I'm doing it in the middle. It's already in the middle of my present. Brian, you messed things up.
The Gatchel Brawl.
I did not.
All right. So, we're not doing a shameless book plug just yet. We will get to that. So,
well,
Brian
just did,
and
but go ahead.
Okay, never mind. Brian, just go for it.
Oh, you said you're doing it later.
Who's the excited puppy now?
All right, everybody, let's get back. So, Masha and Brian, there's an article out that talks about the 5 stressors of modern life. And, I think that most of us can guess what these are, but let's just think about our days. Let's go back a few years, first of all, because Brian and I are now full-time RVers. We decided to get rid of a lot of stress so we don't have the same lifestyle now. But several years ago, we were doing the typical corporate life where we left at 7 in the morning. So we fought traffic for an hour. We got to work, and then we had long, busy, stressful days. We fought traffic then for an hour going home, and it wasn't unusual for us to be on our computers at night working. Not always, of course, but we all had deadlines that we had to work around. So, if we think about it, there are a number of stressors that we encounter during the day that our ancestors 100 years ago, 150 years ago didn't encounter. One, they weren't on the roads with millions of people. Two, they didn't sit in front of computers and TVs, all day long and electronics. Three, if there was something in their atmosphere or their environment that caused a feeling of danger, they often did rely on these fight or flight skills. Literally, you're going to fight it, do something about it right then and there, or you're going to run from it. And, unfortunately, as much as we would like to, when you're in a modern lifestyle, it's very rare that you can fight or run from the stressors. So let's get into it. Masha, Brian, what do you think? Are we born with stress management skills, or is this something we have to learn as we go through life?
I think that we are definitely born with some skills that are appropriate for our infant environment, and that's why babies act the way they do. They very clearly communicate with us. It just takes us a while to figure out what that means, right? The stress coping mechanisms are built in. However, I believe that as we grow, we have to learn new skills and adopt as we become more grounded in this environment. So it's a combination. We have the skills, but as we enter the very complex world that we are living in, we have to learn new skills to be able to navigate the life, managing our stress accordingly.
You're forgetting one side of it, though. It's also part of your genetics. How you respond to stress is different for everybody, and it's at a gene level as well. So you can learn stress response, but people who learn the same stress response may not actually use the same stress response because it's not built into them that way. Or it may not work. Even if they use it the same way, they may not be able to get the same ending of the cycle that another person does.
I have a perfect example for that. I completely agree with you. So they are twins. We'll just pretend we know these twins. The twin A is an extrovert and twin B is an introvert. And what happens when they get in trouble and they get in timeout, they both get sent in the corner in their room to close the door. They're grounded in timeout. Extrovert's going to suffer. It's like the worst punishment ever. Introvert is going to celebrate. Oh, yes, thank you, bye. So that punishment doesn't quite fit because they do manage and respond to stress differently.
All right. Well, you guys are getting us into the debate right off the bat of nature versus nurture. Before we continue, I am going to give a shameless plug. If you find this content helpful, please help us reach 1 million hearts by subscribing and following us. We would greatly appreciate it. All right. So we've already talked about one of the big questions in mental health, physical health, nature versus nurture. So we are going to talk today about some of both. So for those who are in the stress management field, they categorize different types of coping responses. We have chosen to take one category and sort of make it our own here at Rekindle, which we're calling supportive. So we talk about supportive coping methods for stress as those healthy underlying habits. So your diet, your rest, your sleep, and getting physical movement. We actually did an entire episode on this, and we'll put the link down below where we talk in depth about resting, diet, exercise, and some of the challenges that we face in our stressful, busy lives. But then there's two others that we often talk about and that you'll see often in the literature. One is emotional coping or emotional focused coping and problem focused coping. So these are categories that help us think about how we manage stress. So we're going to go into those a little bit today. But one of my questions that I want to start out with both of you. So let's go back at least a couple years. So Brian and I, we are now goodness, 3 years, I guess, out of our, or maybe at least 2 years out of our burnout situation. Masha is, now well through recovery. So we've kind of gone through professional, personal burnout, and we're on the other side of it. We all had to learn stress coping skills that we didn't know before. But my question is, what were your stress management skills before you went through burnout? And what is your natural, if you have one, do you tend to rely on supportive coping methods? Do you tend to rely on emotional coping methods? Or do you tend to rely on problem-based? Are you finding that there is one that you naturally gravitate towards? And here's where we're kind of getting back into that nature versus nurture.
I think it's kind of just depends. I mean, before I got to a point where it didn't matter what I did, I was just burned out. I had a lot of different coping methods that I used that I don't think I realized because I liked being out in nature. I don't know how many times I'd go on drives up into the mountains and just be by myself, and I'd sit in the back of my pickup bed, journal about something or write poems or whatever I was doing at the time, have my time with myself and God. And that was one way of stress coping. And then I'd also hang out with friends on the weekend camping. I did a lot of outside stuff. But as you get older, get married, life starts to happen, you start losing some of those natural things you did, and you don't even realize that you're not picking up those coping methods that you need to that help you get out of it. So it just adds up and you don't really get that release, at least as far as what I experienced myself.
Interesting. Interesting how you talk about, yes, we do have natural coping methods, but sometimes life interferes and we don't use them. Masha, what about you?
Well, early on, I adopted a very, now that I know it's not a healthy coping method, as a overfunctioning savior and with superhero syndrome, my zone of genius of coping with everything, life and work related, was problem solving coping methods. And that's the area I existed and I got stuck in. I did not take the time for emotional coping. I did not take time for supportive coping. One, I did not prioritize them. They weren't important. And that's the cultural conditioning I grew up with. Your emotions, get over it. Get over there, get it done. So that's the stigma I grew up with, is that emotional is weakness, supportive. There's no time for supportive coping methods. What are you talking about? You work 2 jobs, you have kids, you have home, you have activities, and it just goes on and on and on. All the things. And I used to say, I carry the world on my shoulders. And over the time, now that I've recovered from burnout and worked with professional, and I still do, I use all three because I naturally do default to problem solving. That's part of ingrained DNA and inheritance that I've gotten. There's the genes there for you. But I have to be very watchful because very quickly, if I don't use the right supporting methods, I very quickly get back into the sick mode. And my body punishes me by just shutting down. It doesn't tell me. There are warning signs. I now recognize them. And just yesterday, I was talking to my therapist, and I was, telling her everything that's going on. My grandmother has a very aggressive form of dementia, and it's progressing very, very quickly. And there's a new symptom that came up, which of course stressed me out because it started to impact me during my sleeping hours. And she called me out. Well, what are you doing about that? I'm like, what can I do about it? She's my grandmother. I have to take care of her. But there's problem, right? Solving. But she's like, okay, that's fine. That's something you do have to deal with. But how do you take care of you? And I'm like, oh. So, yes,
All
I
right.
did learn the
So Masha,
importance of the other two.
mhm. It's interesting because what Brian was talking about with going on long drives and, camping and being out in nature. So that is actually a combination of two of those methods. So it's a combination of supportive because, of course, when you're out in nature camping, you're doing some physical exertion. It's also emotional calming, and that going for a long drive where you are switching your mind to a different setting. And so it's interesting because Brian, what you talked about was primarily
Well, you're not
emotional.
just
Masha,
switching
what
your
you
mind to a different setting. You're that was my time to think about all the things that were going on.
Mhm,
So yes, it's probably was a combination of problem focused and emotion focused because
mhm,
um, there was a lot of emotions I generally had to work with, but I also had to figure out how to get through those, and I had to tell myself sometimes just to get out of my own head, and it wasn't what I was thinking, and that type of thing. Um, so that's where some of that was, especially, and the drive helped that, but sitting in nature really helps that too, because that's your time to meditate and think, and that's more emotion based, I think.
mhm. Yeah. So it's just funny because I would say that my primary go-to naturally was in the supportive realm because especially when I was younger, I was very, very physically active and I was into diet and I made sure I got enough sleep. But I was doing sports almost or some type of working out sports almost every day. And I relied on that to help me get through stressful situations. So that was more of my natural inclination. So it's interesting because we all have these different natural inclinations of where we're going to go to. And Brian, I like that you pointed out that sometimes it is a combination. It's not always like it's one or the other. Um, but we definitely have the things that we go to naturally. But then Masha, you pointed out something that we need to be thinking about, and we often don't because we just think, oh, well, I know how to deal with stress. But do we? And then we find out, as you did, Masha, that we do have coping methods, but those coping methods are not always sufficient for the stressors that come along. So
The right
I'm going to take
ones.
the right one. Yeah. So I'm going to take a step back and just talk about the different types of stressors. So there are different models out there, but the one that we like um, is kind of a two. It sort of differentiates between the stressors that are in your environment versus the interpersonal stressors. So we cause our own stress. Some of that is our mindsets. Some of that is our physical and genetic predispositions that are going to affect us as we go through life. But then we also have these stressors that are in our environment. So we have our relationships. We have stress that comes from our family members who we love. But sometimes there are stressors. Sometimes it comes from our colleagues at work. Sometimes it's in our environment, our hectic drive through traffic, the constant noise that we're exposed to, being on computers and electronics all the time. And then we have this thing called performance stress, which when it comes to burnout, this is what we think of. And what we mean is our jobs. Other types of, could be sports where we feel this need to perform. So we have multiple different stressors coming at us. And yet sometimes we think that our natural inclinations for stress management is sufficient to get us through all of these different stressors. And we think it's a sign of weakness to admit, oh, maybe I do need help. Maybe I do need to learn some different coping methods. So there's different types of stress. There's different types of coping methods. And one of the important skills that we all have to learn as we go through life is how to match our coping methods with the stressor that's coming at us. So just a little bit about that. Why is it important to match that be able to match coping skills to the stressor? Any thoughts on that? Well, I'll
It's
jump in at
the
once.
I see Brian
it's the
talking with his eyes already.
We have to give Brian a little chance. He's our introvert. We have
well,
to give him a
you're
chance to
saying that,
process.
but you're not giving me any chance. You just keep talking in. It doesn't help that there seems to be a little delay today. By picking the coping method that best handles that stressor, it's the quickest way to end that response. And that's what you always want to do, is end that response as quickly as possible. There's multiple ways you can end that response, but some could take a couple of days, and that's not really a good method if you can end it almost immediately and catch yourself and you start to notice that. And that's one thing that we, all three of us, have started to realize, that when we get into that stressor, we start noticing that stressor really soon. And then we can oh, okay, I know how to get out of this now. So that it's really important to know stressor versus coping.
Right. I'm gonna add a little to that. I do agree with that. It's important to have a menu, a la carte menu. We call it my Rekindle Kit, and have those strategies lined up for you so that we can use them. But before that, that's your emergency kit, right? I had a stressor. What do I do? Right? Usually we either shut down or get angry at somebody, and or there's other ways. But what I found is that if you have a proactive approach to being intentional about your week and just planning things out, spending some quiet time, doing some healthy habit things during the day, spending some time in the sunshine, go take a walk around the block or the park or whatever that is, just some of the things that I enjoy to do. And that would be you'll be more in tune, you'll be more in the present. And this is what I found with myself, is yesterday sitting with my therapist, the sky is falling. She's like, well, what happened? Like, why did you regress? Like, okay, on Monday, this happened. On Tuesday, this happened an hour early. On Wednesday, this happened. It's the same thing. And I told her, I'm trapped in Groundhog Day. Working with somebody, taking care of somebody who has dementia, you are literally trapped in a Groundhog Day. And this is one of the worst movies ever made. I personally, it's the worst movie ever made. Let me rephrase that, because I, live in that sometimes, and it adds to my stress. But she asked, well, what are you doing about it? I'm like, I need a sabbatical before I'm nearing the tip of a cliff again, and I feel it. I'm seeing all the signs. I'm seeing all of my helpful strategies during the day that I do. I'm beginning to neglect them, and that is my first warning sign. If I don't do my daily devotional, I'm like, uh-oh, it's day number 2. I missed my daily devotional. And it's alarm bells are going off. I'm like, okay, signs. What do I do next? Just some thoughts there.
Yeah, and it's so funny, Masha, because even listening to the way you approach it's like, yep, you're our problem solver, because you're immediately trying to figure out, how do I organize my week? How do I incorporate, what I need to in order to not get stressed out? But you bring up a good point, which is that sometimes there's so many stressors coming at us, and they're coming at us so quickly that we have to learn new stress coping skills. Um, so we need a variety of skills because, for example, like with the supportive skills, they're not going to help you in the moment for the most part. Now, that's not entirely true if, you have something stressful happen and you can go take a 10-minute walk. So that physical activity that will help you. But let's face it, let's put a, normal situation that we face. If you're in the corporate world, you face this. You're in a meeting, somebody gets aggressive or decides to be very opinionated and they're pushing your buttons. Stressor right there. Well, you can't get up and fight them. Try that and see where that gets you with your manager. You also can't run out of the meeting. Like, there's no way to deal with it by a typical fight or flight type coping method. So sometimes you have to have a different way to cope with that stressor in the moment. It might be a little different than the way that you're going to cope with it after the moment. So just for a moment, we're going to go through the emotional coping, what that means, and problem-focused coping. And I want to get your thoughts on some of these. So emotional focused coping is exactly what it sounds like, where in the moment, so you're in that meeting or you're in that confrontational relationship with a family member, a colleague, whoever it is, you can't fight them, or in most situations, you probably can't. You can't run from them. So you have to have some way to bring that emotion back down to a calm state. That's the whole point of the emotional coping. So we're going to talk about problem-focused coping in a second, but I would say for me personally, this is a tough one because I think of all of the types of coping, this is the hardest for me. Is that true for you, Masha? And Brian can probably attest to this. I'm not a person who shares easily when it comes to emotions, but I struggle with this one. Is this true, or how do you guys? What emotional coping do you use, and is it something that's natural versus learned for you?
My old mindset was emotional coping is dumb. My new mindset, after I found the value of it, it does take work. It's possible for you to learn emotional coping. And my new mindset for that is it is necessary and it's life-saving. It is the one thing that I had to learn, and it is the one thing that helps me connect with the now. I've never been a reactive person. I've always been a proactive person. But when I'm stuck in that emotional stressor, if I have an aggressor coming at me, I don't immediately go and fight. My immediate reaction is to diffuse situation to calm things down, the nurture way of things. And practicing that, usually take a step back, take a deep breath, analyze, how do you feel first as you? Are you in danger? Are you just angry that this is happening? But it's not necessarily helpful to deal with emotional coping right then and there. You have to have self-control and self-will to deal with the situation first. And then you can take a step back and journal to reflect on, okay, I felt this. And that's where I usually never got to. I dealt with it and I swept
Mm.
it under the rug and I kept going. But now, when I have a feeling and I don't know what it is, I have to really pray and meditate. Well, what is this physical feeling? Like, oh, it's emotion. Okay, what emotion is it? And then you go through your my 5 whys. Well, why do I feel this way? And I get to a very particular um, event. And a lot of times, it's not related to that immediate stressor. It just helped me realize it because I've had that feeling already for a little bit. And then I did not end the stress cycle. So it carried on and built up at the next time that emotion was provoked.
Mm. So I heard you mention journaling as a coping, as effective coping for you when it comes to emotions. Are there any other emotion focused coping methods that you have learned to use?
Oh, absolutely. I think a lot of it has to do with taking the time, taking the quiet time, and really be present with myself and check in through all the emotions and where I'm lacking. And the quiet time does it for me, even if I don't get it to the journaling. But things like being outdoors it totally resets my psyche. It totally grounds me into the moment. What I also like to do during the day, and when I forget it, I don't have as a successful day. When I work, I have classical music. I have Mozart playing, and it's just calming. It unlocks my focus and creativity, and it puts me in that space of, oh, I love to work and focus, even though I hate the task in front of me. And there's lots of other ones. Like this weekend, for example, I'm taking one of my girlfriends to a spa day because she just finished a nursing program and she's on verge. She is in burnout and unrecognized burnout. And I think she's kind of like, I'm looking in the mirror and I'm like, we got to do something. So we're going to do a spa day. So that way we're actually driving 2 hours to an area. We're going to do the spa day. Then we're going to do some physical therapy, some massage therapy. We're going to do some sauna, some floating, some aromatherapy, some sound therapy. So those types of things help recognize emotions and let them go, because you can't let them go unless you recognize what those are. Just some examples of things that I use. But I think the most important one for me, which is also a proactive one, is reconnecting to the now. And this is where there's so many distractions, like you mentioned. There's so much noise. There's ping from computer, iPad. There's just like nonstop. You walk in and it's like a casino of sounds that are happening around you. And that does cause stress. So I think one of the most important things is taking the time to reconnect with myself, with God every single day, making that time. When I do, things go amazing. When I don't, I get caught up in the chaos.
And Brian may disagree with you on the whole Mozart thing, but I do like the fact that you point out music, which could make a tremendous difference. So, okay. So, Brian, I know Mozart's probably not your favorite, but what are your emotional coping methods? You've talked a little bit about being out in nature. Are there any others that you've had to learn over these past couple years as we've been out on sabbatical and then, starting a whole new life?
Um, well, reading the book that's coming out here in the next 9 months was probably my biggest emotional support during this time of recovering from burnout. But I had a really good friend, Martin Shell, that he walked with me a lot. I was able to overcome a lot of things that probably were emotion based. Just to be able to talk through that and having that type of support was really helpful. During the sabbatical time, most of my came from just allowing my emotions to come and then just working through them. We tend to suppress those emotions because we don't want to deal with them, but at some point you got to start letting them come out so that you can start working through them. And that takes time, and there's not necessarily any like major thing that you can do other than just let that emotion come out and work through its process of what's going on. And then you have a little bit of, I don't know if it's emotion focus, but you're trying to work through, like Masha has said, the 5 whys. You're like, well, why am I feeling this way? Should I be feeling this way? How can I change my thought on this? What if I'm looking at this from the wrong angle? And I had to start looking at this not from a victim, but from, well, what were the things that I did that helped this situation happen the way that it did? Where did I go wrong? How can I make that change? So it's changing perspective from potential victimhood to, okay, I was the one who perceived it wrong. I was the one who had the wrong reaction. And it's not always the case, and I'm not saying it is, but that's how I approached it during the sabbatical time that we were talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because Brian, we're getting the the male perspective on this, because we've now talked to a couple other folks who have talked about how it's not uncommon for men to suppress and internalize. So I do know during our sabbatical there were a lot of emotions, and just it's funny because we'd come back to Denver, which is where we were from, and even hitting that environment would trigger it, because I'd be sitting in the car with you and all of a sudden we'd hit like Metro Denver and you're just like, oh, yeah, a lot of that is coming back.
The first year and a half, go back to Denver after we left, it was like all of those emotions and stressors, even though they weren't there anymore, they were all just jumping right in front of my face. And thankfully, after time, you can work through those. I don't have that anymore. But coming back to Denver is something that I'll probably never enjoy that.
I can attest to that too. And I've been a Denverite since 1995, since we moved continents. So I consider myself local. And I can totally relate. And I think we actually had a conversation about this once. Does anybody else feel this when you go outside to outside of the States and, for vacation, business trip, whatever, you come back, you like enter a thick fog. Like, what happened? And it's instant. So it's interesting that I feel it too. Coming back to Denver, I do get to take some weekends on East Coast due to some nice privileges we have as a family. But when I come back, I'm like, whoa, it's like instant, that
Yeah, and
feeling.
that's interesting, because that that in itself is a form of emotional coping, which is kind of separating yourself or getting out of a situation long enough to let your brain process and start to deal with some of those emotions. But I'm kind of getting into the weeds here, which we're not going to do too much today. We'll have further episodes coming up where we're going to dive a little deeper into some of these types of coping, and particularly emotion focused will, I think, be our next one. But it sounds like what I'm hearing is, yes, you had some natural skills. You also had to learn some, particularly in burnout recovery. And one more I'm just going to throw in there, because Brian and I do this frequently now, is breathing. We don't necessarily always recognize this, but the power of taking those deep intentional breaths and really breathing out is
Yes,
something
I'm
that we've all
missing them
gotten.
when I'm being
Yeah.
intentional about that, but okay.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sighs. I don't think those are intentional. Those are just reaction.
And that's a natural coping method as well. But that is something we do a whole lot more of, is taking those deep breaths and being intentional about that, to immediately start that calming process. That's one coping method you're going to hear everywhere, that comes in very handy in the moment when you can't run, you can't change your situation, and you need that emotional calming right away.
I want to
So
add something
we're
to
going
that
to, oh, go ahead,
really
Masha.
quick. Okay. So breathing, I think it's an excellent call out. I did not notice this until somebody told me, breathe. I'm like, what are you talking about? I hold my breath when I'm stressed, when I'm in those situations. So breathing is important, don't you think? So
Very.
catch yourself if your breaths get more shallow or you stop breathing. I hold my breath, and I don't know for how long I hold my breath. I get that feeling. I'm like, what's that feeling? Oh, I got to breathe. And then when I take a breath, people are like, what's wrong with you? Why are you mad? I'm like, I'm just breathing. I am not mad. I'm just breathing. Releasing tension. Try it.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. And I'm one of those who loves to walk, meditate, and breathe, and do
Mm.
that all at the same time. That is when I practice meditations, when I practice breathing. And right now, with 2 dogs, I spend a lot of time walking in the RV lifestyle. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next category, which is problem-focused coping. So it's exactly what it sounds like, but you're basically trying to mitigate, decrease that stressor, or just get rid of it all the way around if you can. And there, again, are a number of actual separate methods here. And I am going to stop and just I'm going to give our book plug now. So in our book that is going to be published this fall, we actually talk about our journeys, and we do talk about these types of coping in much more detail than we do today. So problem-focused coping, what problem-focused coping methods do you use? What did you have to learn versus what do you feel like you were just born with?
I'm a natural procrastinator, so problem-focused coping methods um, was something that I definitely had to learn. And being from the engineering world, the whole idea of what we're doing is problem-focused coping because we're trying to meet
Mm.
a deadline and we want to be done well before the deadline happens so we're not up until midnight trying to submit something that is not done as well as it should be because you had to rush through it. So um, just the field that I was in had to teach me that. But then being a natural procrastinator, I'm always at war with that idea of finding ways to stop that stressor before it happens.
For me, I don't know if I don't think I've learned it. I hate to say this, but I'm just born with it. Problem solving has just been always, always my zone of genius. And to this day, I have a problem in front of me or a situation or anything, my brain automatically thinks, what's the best thing that can happen? What do I want to happen? And what's the worst thing that's going to happen? What's the worst possible thing that can happen? And then
Okay, but
realistically,
that's the immediate
you
response. Everybody kind
no,
of
this
has
is
that problem solving on an immediate response. But what about something that you know is coming up? How do you solve it then? Did you
and
naturally just
I'm trying to explain it if you'd only listen.
I was listening.
It's part of my thinking process with anything that can come up or anything that is coming up or anything that is a surprise. What's the best thing? What's the worst thing? Realistically, it's going to happen somewhere in the middle. And therefore, it takes it takes a lot to get an emotion out of me, and I usually am very reserved. That's just something that just works for me.
Okay.
So Masha, a follow-up question though is where has problem-focused coping failed you, and why did you have to learn the others if this is your natural instinct?
Where it failed me, I wasn't prepared for that question. I was imperfect. No, I'm kidding. I'm perfectly imperfect. I think the problem solving where it failed me is that having that overachiever personality and not being able to say no, solving other people's problems and enabling individuals to abandon their problems and leave it for somebody else to solve. And being in a place where I default to helping and volunteering versus, letting things just figure its way out, I tend to jump in and save the situation. And it's oftentimes not my job nor my role, nor is it asked of me. So I would say
Mm.
one of the character flaws I definitely have worked through and learning to bite my tongue and just let things come. But in my mind, I already have all the answers, all the ins and outs, and if it's useful, I'll use it. But trying to walk away from the problem I know I can help solve is really hard for me.
So actually, you're bringing up a particular problem-focused coping method, which we don't often think about, but that is boundaries. So you were on the problem-focused coping methods. You were already good at actually figuring out, how to solve all these problems, but it sounds like you were missing the boundaries piece. So
Oh,
it sounds like
totally.
that's something you've had to learn.
Both sides of the coin completely. And because I would be that energy, I allowed that energy come in and rid chaos instead of setting clear boundaries and not letting my peace be disturbed. And this is something we're also going to talk about in one of the future episodes called Finding Your Peace.
And Brian, what are your thoughts on problem? Because, as an engineer, you are an amazing problem solver. But I'm curious, where has that either failed you or where have you had to learn new skills? And I actually think you're pretty good with boundaries for the most part.
Yeah, I I had to learn boundaries as well. I mean, anytime when you're young and you're impressionable in your 20s, you want to make sure that you're making the good impressions. And once you start to learn where people are starting to take advantage of you, you either let that happen or you start setting boundaries. And eventually you just have to start setting boundaries because it wears on you. So I learned boundaries just like Masha is learning boundaries from instances at work or whatever where I constantly felt like I wasn't getting the value that I should have, or I wasn't
Mm.
feeling the value that I should have for what I've done. And the way Masha was talking about problem solving, I do that too. I always look at the plus and the minuses, and being somewhat pessimistic, seeing the negative is pretty easy. So if you're always figuring on the worst case scenario, anything that happens above that is great most of the time. So, um,
And oftentimes it gets misinterpreted. If you look at, you look at the best, but you also look at the worst, and we usually tend to verbalize the worst a little bit more. And I've been told, I'm like, why do you always look at the worst side? I'm like, no, it's really a trait of resilience when you are able to look at all outcomes and then pivot to the right direction and correct course and action as situations progress. So, what do you guys think about that?
I agree. I mean, if you can start thinking about the worst outcome, then, like I said, anything that happens after that is better than what was giving you anxiety for. So it may still give you some anxiety, it may still give you some stress, but it's not going to be the worst. So you're able to make, and if the worst does happen, well, you've already thought about it, and it's not as big of a shock to your system, and you're able to recover from it quicker.
And there's a saying that I grew up with actually, and it just didn't resonate until now. Expect the best, plan for the worst. Huh.
Yes. Which
Yeah,
is
I don't know that I
interesting
ever
because
expected the best, though.
that's
That's the
that is
pessimist in
somewhat
me.
true with personality, isn't it? But it's interesting because that is kind of it appeals both to the emotion side and the problem side because you're expecting the best. So you're looking for a good outcome. Your mindfulness comes in there. Yet at the same time, the problem solving side, be prepared to solve that problem. So that's interesting. Even in that saying, you're covering both the emotions and the problem solving. Um, okay, so Masha, go ahead.
Yes, I was going to say there's a flip side of this, and it's a mindset change because a lot of people that I know, they expect the worst. No, they expect the worst, plan for the best. So they still want
Huh.
to plan, but their expectations is it's the end of the world. It's gonna not work, and I'm like, no, 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 whoa, whoa, okay, well, it's the other way around. Just flip the analogy, and you're good.
I haven't. Well, I suppose that is true, especially today. Good point. All right. So I'm going to talk about another concept from our book. We talk about the Rekindle Kit. And part of that is understanding your stressors, and then it's putting together a list of coping methods, some of which you may have to learn, and some of which, we all have learned. So my question for you is, what is in your Rekindle Kit for supportive, emotional, and problem-based coping methods? Problem focused, because Brian's going to correct me.
I've been focused.
Go. Go, Masha. I'm going to volunteer you first.
I'm doing one of them right now is actually
Ah.
something that we are making available, seasonal fragrance scent for aromatherapy, essential oils that help with certain things. And one of those things is aromatherapy is it helps you breathe. It helps you open up your lungs and it helps you connect with the now. And it really, if you start practicing it like I had to, it was one of those things that held me grounded when chaos was around me. I was like, okay, too
Mm.
stressful. And I started breathing in my aromatherapy, and instantly I felt tension just start melting off. It's a reminder. So that's one of the things that's in my kits. But Brian, do you want to talk about yours first?
Not necessarily, but I guess I can. Um, I have to get in my head quite a bit, so I generally will sit down and think about what's going on if I'm starting to get stressed out and just try to work through those emotions and those thoughts because that happens to me a lot. Um, being a
Brian,
problem
I'm going to stop
solver,
you. for just a second.
Okay.
So what do you do when you're in your head? Like, do you are there any tools that you use? Do you journal? Do you write? What do you do when those thoughts are in your head?
I start working through them. I just start asking myself why and trying to see whether, like I was saying before, I have to start seeing whether it's from me or whether something actually came and is coming at me. And then how do I deal with that? If it's from me, then I can start working through, well, why am I feeling this way? If it's not, then I can start trying to come up with solutions to how to get around this. Um, I do journal some. I don't journal a lot, but I used to write a lot of poems in my 20s, and that was probably my main source of that type of coping. And I do kind of miss that, and occasionally I do write poems, but nothing like I did in my 20s. Michelle?
Okay. Um, what about in supportive coping? Have you or are you learning any of the skills there? So rest, diet, exercise.
Um,
Put you on the spot.
yes and no. Listen to our next week episode where I talk about exercise being a 4-letter word, and that kind of describes the rest part. Um,
And to tease him a little bit, I came across an exercise coach facility. I was like, oh, I'm going to take a clip of that and send to Brian.
and I texted her back, and it's like, they spelled couch wrong. But
Couch coach
being out
works
in
too.
nature is probably my biggest rest. So, as far as
Very,
supportive goes.
yeah. And we have done a lot of that over the past 2 years. And I agree with you. That's actually one of mine as well. So, yes, thankfully, that's something we can do together. All right, Masha, what's in your Rekindle kit?
All right. So mine actually is a box of stuff that helps.
Okay.
And
Okay. So,
we,
so before you get started, don't unpack the whole box, or I'll tell you to land the plane.
you might one day may be able to buy it in our store. I haven't made the decision yet. So as I mentioned earlier, aromatherapy is huge, but one of the favorite ones that I like to utilize is self-care. So for me, it used to be massage, but I'm not quite there yet. It's reflexology. So foot reflexology and face reflexology has done wonders of releasing stress and tension. And it's something that I proactively use now. It's part of my routine. So every 4 to 6 weeks, I am there on the clock. And by then, I'm already at the place where I really need it. Other coping methods that are in my toolbox are obviously spa. We love to treat and release some of the tension, and hopefully it is with a friend. My mom has a hot sauna, so during the winter times we go there once a week, and oh my goodness. Well, one, you have a friend you can share life, and you know the saying goes, share share your story once, carry half the burden, share it again, it's half of that burden. And by the time that you shared enough, you no longer have that stressor. You already processed it verbally and emotionally with a friend, and use problem solving skills on that too. Other tools that I love to physically engage in is taking a time out and drinking tea, herbal tea, non-caffeinated teas. Of course, I do like my caffeine, but when I am stressed, caffeine actually adds to the anxiety and steals my sleep. So I'm really cautious on gauging. Can I have a cup of coffee today? That's a bad idea. I'll have one tomorrow if I get enough sleep, right? So I try to use a lot of proactive methods. Also, therapist is on my routine, even if I don't feel like I need to go. Or yesterday I was like, I'm really not feeling well. I'm just going to ditch it. And something inside of me, my intuition talks to me, and I listen. I learn to listen because she's always right. And said, go and talk. And she held me accountable. She's like, okay, well, I'm beginning to see some signs of stressors. So what are you going to do about it? And for me, also using PTO. PTO
Mm.
is there for you to use when you're healthy, not when you are sick. So that was my mindset. I need to hoard my PTO. I may need it, and then take a vacation and then use it for sickness. You have sick days for that, but I've learned to proactively use PTO for self-care and make sure I'm in tune with myself. And other things like handy, crafty things that I like to do with my hands. So there's some of that in there. For supportive, definitely rest is a challenge. And diet is a 4-letter word, but a great Lent is coming in. So I'm going to be obedient and deny myself all the things that I love just to cleanse my body and my spirit and reconnect with God. That's important for me. And for exercise, my physical therapy routine is really my savior right now, because when I don't do it, I feel the consequences of it. And I'm slowly beginning to get into yoga, something that I really love. It connects my body, my mind, my
Mm.
spirit with the breath, and really grounds me in the moment. So I really, really miss it. I've gone last week. Halfway through, I was fine. The other half, I almost died. Did you not? I was like, okay, I'm happy I'm here, but I did make it. So
I'm pretty sure I'm hearing that plane.
go for it.
No, we just need to land the plane in general.
Yes. Yes.
All right. So Masha, you've got some great skills. I would say that mine, my natural was a supportive, a lot of movement, physical movement. I used to eat healthy. I'm not going to say that I do right now, but we're working on that. So I would say that is what I'm working on, is a healthy stress reduction diet. Being out in nature, thankfully, Brian and I share that. Or, if we didn't share that, I think we probably would have had some problems over the past 2 years of full-time RVing, because that is a big reason to do it, is to be out in nature. So I would say that, walking the dogs, meditation, which I often do while I walk. I would say hobbies are in my Rekindle kit, and I always have some kind of sewing project with me, just to be able to reconnect and use your hands in that way. I would say that I've had to learn some emotional coping skills. I've had to learn to actually talk to Brian more, and he will say that I am not the most communicative, and I'm working on
You're
it, but
not.
I'm still not great at it. Let's face it.
The
Yeah,
plane's
go
late
ahead.
for
Throw me under the
takeoff.
bus. Yeah.
No, the
Oh,
plane's
you're
late for
being nice to me.
takeoff.
Okay. So I would say I'm learning some of those emotion focused skills. All right. So I do know it's time to land the plane, and we all have lives, and Masha has a daughter who's going to be calling her if she doesn't show up to pick her up. So
Don't forget me,
to
Mom.
end
You
up,
forgot me again.
yeah. So to end up, I want you guys just to answer one quick question. What is your tip for how can people learn new stress coping methods if they need to? Go for it, Masha.
No, let's just land the plane.
I can
All
talk
right.
for
Well,
another hour.
okay, 2 minutes or less. One tip.
One
We're
tip.
50 minutes in.
We had a lot of tips, but I think one tip
Yeah,
is
but you got to leave
important.
in 5 minutes, and we're 50 minutes in.
It's okay. I'm waiting for the call. One tip.
We're
I'll just
supposed
do
to be
one tip.
45 minutes.
I know, 52.58 seconds and counting. All right, one tip. I'll
All
just say
right.
one tip. The most important tip that I think that I have implemented that is life-saving is quiet time. I plan at least 10 minutes of quiet time, no technology, no screens, just me in the moment, connecting my mind, my body, my spirit, the breathing and prayer, meditation, whether it's outside on the porch, in the walk, or just sitting on the floor, or standing on the floor, whatever that is, it's 10 minutes of just existing and being in the moment.
That's great advice. All right, Brian, I'm going to land the plane since we need to. But I do want to invite people to share in the comments. What are your stress coping techniques? What do you rely on? And are there any new ones that you're learning? And then if you did find this information helpful, please help us by subscribing and following. And, our goal is to reach 1 million hearts to help us all beat burnout and manage stress. And then join us next time as we have more conversations about stress coping methods and living the kind of lives that we want to. Any final words?
Be great and breathe.
Great advice. All right. Thank you, everyone.